All right, so thank you for coming this morning. As you can imagine, it's quite an honor to be invited to be a keynote speaker here at South by Southwest. And when I started thinking about it, South by Southwest actually has a pretty warm spot in my heart, simply because I think out of almost all the festivals I've screened at, probably South by has had the most amount of work that I've ever made. Thanks for some of the shout outs from Jared in his introduction, but as a director, I've had a lot of feature films here, short films, a lot of music videos, and as a DP, I've had a lot of projects here as well, and also as a producer. In fact, this year, I'm actually here with a film that I'm a co-producer on called Pahokee. So I've been at this festival wearing many different hats. And I would like to think this is probably why I got invited to speak to you today. And I think what I'm going to do is just speak a little bit about my career as what I'm calling an industry outsider. And I have to tell you, when I first got asked to do this, I think I felt a little bit of pressure because, we're living in a very crazy time. I felt a little bit of pressure to make some kind of big statement to you or make some kind of call to action. But realistically, when I think about it, I'm a storyteller, I'm a filmmaker. I'm assuming probably the room is filled with filmmakers and storytellers, and we give our messages through telling stories. So I think what I'm going to do today is just share my personal story about, I guess, how I ended up standing on this stage, and maybe in that process you'll get a lot of. You'll get to know a little bit more about the work and just kind of the way that I think about films and making films. So I kind of want to start off saying that, I don't consider myself your typical filmmaker. Like, I remember at some point being in film school and sitting around with a lot of film students and people talking about, growing up in the 80s and watching movies like E.T. and really identifying with that. And that definitely was not my experience. I did not grow up thinking I was going to be a filmmaker. I didn't, have the intention on making films. And in fact, thinking about a movie like E.T., I think a lot of filmmakers that I spoke to said that they really identified with the kids and, that kind of nostalgia for, excuse me, the nostalgia of that kind of suburban neighborhood. And that definitely was not my experience. I mean, if anything, I probably identified more with E.T. as an alien, right? And I do think that, I think at that moment, if aliens came down from outer space and told me that I was a space alien, I think I probably would have believed that and identified with that a lot more. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background just to kind of understand that. But I was born to immigrant parents, right? My parents are born and raised in the Philippines. They immigrated to North America separately. My mom immigrated to Toronto, Canada, and lived there for a number of years, and my dad immigrated to New York. And as the story would go, my mom visited New York, met my dad, and the rest is kind of history. And now as an adult, when I'm thinking about that, to think about picking up and leaving your home country and go to a new place where you really don't know very many people, and have a really open adventure ahead of you. I kind of would like to think that I was born to two really bold adventurers, right? I think both my parents were kind of pioneers in their field, right? This is in the late 60s that they did this. So I think this was relatively unheard of, especially thinking about it, especially for my mother, right? As a single woman coming from the Philippines to the United States. I think that, says a lot about who my parents were. But even though they met in New York City, I did not grow up in New York City. I grew up in a small town in Central California called Clovis. Has anyone ever heard of Clovis, California? And not Clovis, New Mexico. Oh, one person has heard about it. Okay. I think when a lot of people think of California, they think of, sunny Los Angeles or the beautiful town cars of San Francisco, the beaches. That is not where I grew up. I grew up in a very small agricultural town, which, for lack of a better words, I would describe as kind of a country suburban town. And this was, a really challenging environment to grow up in. This is in the 80s, so this is during the Reagan era. And I think my parents got very much caught up in, a lot of people were moving to California, thinking about swimming pools and, this growing economy in California. So they ended up going to Clovis, California, which was a very small town, a very white, conservative small town. And in fact, when I was growing up, there were no other Filipino or Filipino Americans that I knew of. My family was the only one. So kind of going back to feeling like I was an alien from outer space a little bit. The area definitely had some Asians and Asian Americans, mostly Japanese, because a lot of the area was farmland that was unfortunately seized during World War II, during the internment camps. And there was definitely a Latinx population, but certainly no Filipinos. So I grew up with a lot of racism. I grew up with a lot of racism. And in fact, I even remember at some point being in school and a kid coming up to me who was Mormon. There was a large Mormon population there. And no disrespect to Mormons, but this kid told me, he said, "Oh, the Philippines, I learned about the Philippines in one of my Sunday schools, and our missionaries went there and thought you guys were monkeys." And I remember really that being a very vivid memory of that happening to me when I was in elementary school. So this is the kind of area, this is the kind of environment that I grew up in. And then to complicate it, on top of that, I was also queer, right? So, you guys know the movement, the 20 by 20? They have a statement that I actually really like, which is called, "Can't be it if you can't see it." And I think in this environment, it wasn't a matter of even you can't be it. It's like you almost just can't even exist as a person, because you've never seen anyone who literally looks like you, behaves like you. So so I think I just considered myself an outsider, right? Like someone who didn't quite belong to this community, someone who always had a different point of view, someone who didn't quite belong in this area. And I was very aware of that from a very early age. And I think it's been a very, for me it was very formative, right? Because I think it's really shaped the way that I look at the world and the way that I, think about work. But, rather than, just kind of disconnect, I think I found, my people. I think I found community. I think I found people who look like me through art. I would go to the record store and listen to music and listen to songs, people describing the way that they felt, which was the way that I felt. Or I would go to, the video store and look at the covers of certain, VHS tapes. So for the millennials in the room, this is pre-internet, right? This is before you could actually just go onto Facebook and type something and find a user group, right? You were really, you really had to explore and search for something. So I did a lot of that through music and through film, even through television. I remember when I was in high school, I was obsessed with Twin Peaks. And even today, I just think that's some incredible television. But art really saved me, I think, at this moment, because it also created a portal, right? A way for me to see beyond what I could just see in front of me in this town. And so, funny enough, when I start thinking about it, when I was young, I actually really did not like school very much, and I actually didn't do very well in school when I was a young kid. But the one subject that really engaged me was art. So I really looked forward to every Friday where there was a craft day or an art day, and that's where I really engaged with everything. But unfortunately, when you're at that age and you're growing up in the environment that I did, you're not encouraged to be creative, and you're not encouraged to explore that side of you. But I think a lot of people saw potential there, so I was encouraged to continue doing well in school, or start doing well in school, right? And I did that, and I certainly started engaging in school, and I think that's important because I saw it as a way for me to move beyond where I was, right? So eventually I made my way to college, and I went to the University of California, San Diego. And when I entered, I remember thinking like, well, if I'm gonna go to school and I'm going to study and I'm gonna work hard, like I'm gonna do this for me. So in high school, I was doing really well in the sciences. So when I entered UCSD, I actually double majored in molecular biology and visual arts, right? I decided I was going to do something for myself, and I was just going to, explore that side. And I know it sounds like a crazy combination, but actually it was a really perfect combination for me, because I know a lot of people think of science as, just hard facts and math and things like that. But realistically, what it's about is it's about exploration, and it's about process and the way you think of something, right? And coming up with a question and seeing if you have an answer for it, and how do you explore and get that answer. And then meanwhile, I was studying art, and art is just boundless, right? So for me, it was a really kind of winning combination. I was thinking a lot about process and the way that I think, and at the same time, I'm just exploring everything and anything. And the art department that I was in was founded largely by conceptual artists from the 70s. So I was taking classes with like performance artists like Eleanor Antin, photography classes with Lyle Ashton Harris, these really amazing artists who made me realize art really is expression, and it's the way that you think of things, and it's a statement that you can make to the world. But for me, a lot of things changed when I was taking all these art classes, and my roommate at the time had a photo camera, and she said to me, well, why don't you take photography as an elective? I think you would really enjoy it. And I had never really thought much of it. And again, for the millennials in the room, this is pre-cell phones, right? So I was not accustomed to walking around taking photos all the time, right? There were no things like selfies yet, right? So taking a photograph in itself was a very special event, right? Like you only took photographs if you were documenting something, if it was a holiday, if it was a celebration. So I wasn't really versed in photography in any way. But I remember picking up the camera and looking through the lens and feeling like, wow, this feels right to me somehow. And there was something in that act of looking through a lens where I remember thinking, I can use this to capture the world and present the world to other people in the way that I see it. And so that was kind of a really huge moment for me. And I think it's something to also point out, because I think throughout my life and throughout my career, there's been these moments where people just offer me something, like, here, borrow this camera. And it actually has such a profound change and impact on kind of my life. So that was really one moment. So during this moment, I'm taking all these photography classes. I decide to switch and become a media art major, and I'm taking photography classes. Meanwhile, I'm starting to explore cinema, right? But also queer cinema, which was a huge deal. I was watching films of amazing artists like Sadie Benning. I was watching films like Paris is Burning. Being introduced to filmmakers like Todd Haynes, and that whole idea of you don't see yourself on the screen, I started seeing myself as an artist on the screen and seeing what these people were doing, and I felt really inspired by it. So at some point, I ran out of photography classes, and I decided I will enroll in a film class, right? Because it's close enough. It's kind of what I thought. And again, this is when, pre-digital. So when I say a film class, I mean actual motion picture film, like 16 millimeter black and white reversal. And if anyone has ever shot that, they will know how challenging it is of a format. And it's very unforgiving. And so because of that, I actually had a very terrible experience because it was very unforgiving. And I remember filming one of my early assignments several times, and everything and anything that could have gone wrong went wrong, right? Like the film broke in the camera, and I remember, and this is wind up metal cameras. So I remember opening the camera and like some film shot out of it because it was bunched up. I filmed something, and I guess I didn't use the light meter correctly, and it all came back unexposed, just unexposed. And then there was another thing where it broke at the lab, and it didn't come back. And I remember just thinking, like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. It's really hard. It requires a lot of people. It's really expensive, and I'm not quite sure I like this. But I finished the assignment, and I remember I finished the class, and my instructor at the time, her name was Babette Mangault, kind of a filmmaker, French filmmaker, came from kind of the French New Wave era. A shout out to Babette. She was one of the first women cinematographers to graduate from the Sorbonne. So she was the real deal, and she really encouraged me. And she said, you know what? I'm gonna sign you up for the next film class. And I remember telling her, oh, Babette, thank you. I just don't think film is for me. It's very difficult. Like, I think I'm gonna go back to, just photography. And she was like, no, you're gonna take my class. And she actually spoke to the counselor and made sure that my schedule worked so I could take her class. I mean, this was like, she had decided, right? But the thing that I have to really, be appreciative of is I think she saw some kind of talent there. She saw something, right? And she said, you have a very unique way of filming this, and I think, you should explore this creativity inside to you. So having that kind of support as someone who's a mentor, and I think this is something important to really mention, is I also think mentorship is such an important thing. And this is certainly the case for me. If it weren't for the fact that Babette saw something in me and really encouraged me and made a way for me to continue, then I certainly wouldn't be here. So I ended up taking this, the next film class, and I loved it. I made my first, what I would really call kind of my first short film. Everything went well. I really enjoyed it. I loved working with people. And I started thinking, well, in photography, I was having this very kind of lonely existence. I think in filmmaking, I found a very collaborative art form. And I really loved how accessible it was. I think a lot of people, when they think of art, they think it's very much only for a certain group of people who understand it, you have to go to a gallery or something. But filmmaking, I think everyone thinks is accessible in one form or another. Everyone thinks that they should be able to watch a film and have an opinion or be able to experience it somehow. So I really appreciated that. So at this moment, I was still studying sciences. And believe it or not, I was actually doing fairly well in it. And I was researching, I was working in a lab. But I was about to graduate, and at that moment, I remember thinking, if I'm going to, this is my life, right? I certainly did not grow up with wealthy parents, so I was taking out student loans, and I was working jobs to go to school, and I remember thinking, if I'm gonna work this hard for the rest of my life, I'm gonna do something I really enjoy. And I felt like I had given science a shot at that point, so I decided, I'm just going to pursue the arts. And when that happened, I think it really shifted the way that I thought about my life, because my associations at that time with artists were kind of like these starving artists, right? Starving artists, right? Like you have that kind of idea, so you just think you're gonna live this life where you probably are not gonna make a lot of money, you're gonna have to have a day job, you're gonna struggle somehow, and no one's really gonna give you much of anything, right? And so I think I kind of had that mentality of, I'm gonna start working in the arts and really pursue this, and it's going to be a struggle, right? So I already knew that kind of going in. So for the next several years, I worked some odd jobs. I mean, everything and anything. I worked for a horse racing track where I climbed like a 100-foot tower and filmed, horses going around in a circle. I mean, really crazy stuff. I moved to Ashland, Oregon temporarily and drove a shuttle for people going to the theaters, which was really amazing because Ashland has an amazing Shakespearean theater festival, so I got to experience some theater in that way with discounted tickets and free seats and things like that. But I kind of always knew that I wanted to go to graduate school and continue my studies since I had just started getting into filmmaking. And I applied to a lot of different programs, and I eventually decided to enroll at UT Austin, the University of Texas at Austin. Right? And I remember thinking at the time, this is in 1999, that Austin was such a strange place. Like, I mean, just the concept of Texas, right? Texas has a reputation, and somewhat rightfully so, right? But Austin had a little bit of mystique about it at the time. I didn't really know much about it other than I remember at some point there was an MTV show about it, Austin Stories, and I remember when I was in high school watching Slacker with friends and just laughing about how could someone make a film like this? And it was so crazy to us, but we loved it. So I ended up moving to Austin and enrolling in film school here. And for me, that was a really great moment because I think I met a lot of filmmakers, and because I had such a strong photography background, I think they naturally saw that I was comfortable with a camera, and I got asked to start filming a lot as a cinematographer. So that kind of started my career also as a cinematographer. And coming from the background that I had come from, I didn't even know what a cinematographer was, to be quite honest. I was like, oh, you're a filmmaker, you're an artist, you do everything. The people in front of the camera are your friends, and you have, and it's very just on the moment and on the fly. So while I was in film school, I think I really learned kind of, a little bit more of an industry model of how films are made, right? And how it can be a creative collaboration. And so, but while I was in film school, I had a moment where, and it was very early on, it was probably the first year I was in school, there was a big Hollywood producer, right, who came to town, and they did one of these things where you could meet with them for like 20 minutes, and they would watch your film and give you, career advice and all these kinds of things. And I remember thinking like, well, this is going to be a really great moment for me. And at the time, I was finishing a film that I had made about two guys breaking up in a laundromat that I just shot like down the street from my apartment. And I remember showing it to him and him saying like, oh, this is really funny, this is really good, but my advice to you is don't make films about gay people, And he said, I'm not gonna say who it was, but he basically said, this will get you nowhere. Like, this is not what people wanna see. This might be the kind of films you want to make, but you should really make something that everyone will want to experience, right? Not just you. And I remember being really like angry at that moment. For lack of a better word, I was like angry. And I started thinking like, why am I even sitting here talking to you? Because I actually don't even like your films. Why am I going to take your advice? I don't like the films that you make. I don't like the way that you're talking about my films. And I'm certainly not going to take this advice. And I think kind of, with my background, which was a little bit to just kind of rebel, and when someone challenges you like that, to kind of be the overachiever and just go for it to prove them wrong, right? Strange enough, I finished that film and I remember thinking like, you know what, I'm gonna make films about LGBT people. This is what I'm gonna do, right? I'm going to prove this person wrong because this is something that I see important to me, and I'm just going to do this. And I think at the time when I was in film school, I really didn't have any expectations. I didn't even think I was gonna stick around and make films afterwards. I thought it was just something that was gonna be a passing phase, right? Since I was just kind of floating around. But it was probably one of the best things that could have happened because I made several short films, all LGBT content, all like, I kind of joke and say it was kind of my sad gay people phase, because it was a lot of, people breaking up in a laundromat, or, someone having this big, shout out with their father, things like that. But I went to lots of film festivals and it was amazing. I mean, the very first film that I screened at a film festival, I premiered it at the Castro Theater in San Francisco at Frameline, which is the San Francisco LGBT Film Festival. And it was an amazing moment. I remember walking out on the stage and there were like 1,000 people there. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy, because I was a film student and I didn't even think this could happen. But one of the things I do have to say is film festivals were so important to me, because whereas there were people in the industry telling me, people don't want to see this, there were film festivals who were championing the kind of work that I was making, and there were audiences at those film festivals. So I do think, for me, film festivals have been really, really crucial and important, especially for encouraging the work of filmmakers such as myself. So I do this for several years, and I'm making these short films, kind of traveling, screening a lot of films, and I'm working largely as a cinematographer. I'm being asked to film a lot of things. And then I shot my first, before I even graduated school, I shot my first feature film called Room. Not to be mistaken by The Room, right? Which, full disclosure, I've actually never seen The Room, so I actually don't know what it's about. I'm somewhat of a bad filmmaker because there's a lot of like kind of probably important, cult classics and classic films that I haven't seen, but I've never seen The Room. I didn't see The Disaster Artist. I didn't know what that was all about. But I made a film called Room, directed by Kyle Henry, which was about a middle-aged woman having like an existential crisis. So it probably couldn't be any more different than The Room. But most importantly, I shot this feature, and it premiered at Sundance, and it premiered at Directors Fortnight. It got nominated for a Spirit Award. And around the same time, I had shot a thesis film that won an ASC award, which is the American Society of Cinematographers, student award. So I think, within this 1 year, like I was kind of the belle of the ball. Like I've gone to everything. I went to like every major film festival. I was in the room with like ASC cinematographers. It was kind of amazing. And it ended up with me getting an agent, right? Someone who said, oh, okay, you're like new talent. We're going to represent you. And for me, this was a huge deal because as someone who thought, oh, I'm going to be a struggling artist for the rest of my life and there's really never going to be an outlet, suddenly I said, oh, whoa, people can actually get paid to work in films and make films, and people live by doing this. And I saw it as, oh, maybe this is something that I can actually do. So in a lot of ways, this became a little bit of a trap, is what I will say, for lack of a better word, because, I had to work. Like, again, I wasn't independently wealthy in any way, so I had to pay the bills, right? Like I had rent to pay, I had like student loans to pay off, like all these things. So I just had to work. So I just threw myself into working as a cinematographer. And for many years, I shot everything and anything, focusing mostly on independent narrative features, which was my love. But also, commercials, music videos, like even like a real estate commercial, or a real estate promotional video, like anything, right? And I remember for several years, I lived out of 2 suitcases. One suitcase that had all my clothing and one suitcase that had film equipment, right? And I did this for many years, and I, would be in New York for a couple weeks shooting something, and I would go to San Francisco and sleep on someone's couch and shoot something there, and I just had to be wherever I had to be. But one of the things I was not doing during this time period was I was not making my own films, right? I was working on other films. But I do think at this point, it was also just excellent training for me, because as a director and as a producer, I don't want to say you're limited, but the amount of time that you have and resources is usually, you're only able to make a certain amount of work. But as a cinematographer, I could shoot 10 films in the time that one person is making their one film. So it really was some of the best training I had, because I was basically watching directors and producers and taking note of things that I thought were really great and taking note of also things that I wanted to avoid, right? Things that I thought were not so great. And one of the things that was really kind of hard to see was I saw a lot of friends who were able to just kind of get out of film school, make their first feature, and just kind of run with it. And I saw a lot of friends who were kind of waiting around, and I was kind of somewhere in the middle. Like I felt like I was really active and working, but I wasn't working on my own films as a director and as a producer. And here's something that I do want to bring up that I think a lot of people, for whatever reasons, I don't know why we don't talk about it more in terms of like the film industry, because we all know it happens, right? Like we'd like to believe that there's a level playing field, but sometimes there's not, right? And one of the things with the film industry that I've come to realize is there are people who are independently wealthy in the film industry. And it's kind of confusing, right? Because when you're a film student and you get out and you wonder like, oh, one of my classmates said they're gonna move to France and live in an apartment in Paris and write a script for 6 months, right? And you're like, oh, how do you do that, right? Like, and I don't know why it just doesn't come, you just think, oh, like, well, maybe it's because they're so talented, and they probably are, right? They're really talented, but also maybe their parents own that apartment, right? And you're thinking like, wow, how are they able to write that script and do all these things? And you're thinking, I don't know how I could do that if I'm working so much. And it's like, oh, well, maybe they didn't have to work that day job the same way that you did. And I think it's great for them if they have those resources available to you. But I think it also made me realize you shouldn't compare yourself to other filmmakers' path, because we don't know what resources people have. We don't know what opportunities they have available to them. But when, early on you start thinking like, oh, these people are getting funded to make their films because they're so talented. And the reality is they could be very talented, and that is part of it. But it also could be they just happen to know certain people, right? Maybe their uncle is the head of so-and-so, or their best friend's brother wants to give them $50,000 as a startup for something. And that might not be your story, and that's fine, right? There's other ways to make films, but there was a little bit of frustration there, and I think I had to realize that it was unfair to me, right? Like, it was unfair for me to say, well, how come I don't know these rich people who are going to give me money, right? That just wasn't my story, right? That's just not my path. So at some point, I think I started realizing I'm actually not making any work here. I'm just working for other people, which was fine, and it was really great, but I was starting to get really antsy, so I decided, like, you know what? I'm just going to take the initiative and start making work. And I remember thinking, like, no one is ever going to ask me to make something as a director. No one's ever going to ask me to produce something as a filmmaker, right? I kind of have to ask myself to do that. And this is where I'm saying you get into a little bit of a freelance, what I'll call a freelance trap, right? Is because you're freelancing and projects are coming to you and you don't want to say no to any of them because A, you're concerned about just paying your bills, and then B, you're concerned that if you start saying no, other people say yes, and you're no longer the person that they're gonna come to. And it's a little bit of a risk to just say, well, I'm gonna put some of this work on hold and focus on my own, but I think it's really important that you take the initiative and make your own work, because again, no one's ever gonna ask you to make something, you have to ask yourself. So fortunately, around this time, I had made a new friend, and his name was Jay Hodges, and we had met at a film festival, and he approached me about working on a project together. And just very briefly, we were at a dinner party where we met someone who had just driven through Trinidad, Colorado. And for those of you who don't know, Trinidad is a small town in southern Colorado. And this person was telling us that it was known as the quote-unquote sex change capital of the world. And it was something that I just was like, what? No, there's no way. There's no way that that's happening in southern Colorado, especially as someone who grew up in a small town. And Jay similarly grew up in a small town. So I think it was something that both resonated with us. And we thought a lot more about it. We started researching about it, and we realized that one of the first surgeries at the time, what was called gender reassignment, or at the time actually called sex change operations or sex reassignment surgery, had happened there in 1968, and it was very surprising that this happened in a small town. And we ended up doing some research. We ended up finding out that the original surgeon was passing on his practice to a new surgeon named Dr. Marcy Bowers, who is also a trans woman. And if you can imagine, this is in 2004, so even the word transgender was not a popular word yet. This is pre-Caitlyn Jenner. This is pre-transparent. I don't even think there were really LGBT people on TV yet, except for maybe one or two people who, maybe were in some side role that committed suicide or something like that, right? So it was, a fairly kind of unexplored idea in terms of film and television at that point. But we decided we were going to make this film. And I had never really worked on it. I had never really made a documentary before. I remember in film school, I was asked to make a short documentary, and I made an experimental film. And even my instructor was like, is this a documentary? I was like, sure, I think it's a documentary. It's real. These are real people. But I was just like, let's do it, right? And I love the idea that I was watching documentary filmmakers just making work. They were not waiting. They were not asking for permission. They were just picking up cameras and going. So I said, let's do that. Let's just get a camera. We'll borrow some sound equipment and let's just go for a week and see what happens. And it was probably one of the best things that happened because suddenly we decided like this could be a film, right? And what was really great about this experience was, I had been a fan of, labs and programs and things like that because as a cinematographer, I had been invited to go to the Sundance Directors Lab, for instance. And I really saw how being part of these kinds of labs were really helpful in terms of nurturing your own work and meeting new people. So I said, let's do that. Let's apply to a lot of these labs. And I remember we got into IFP, which for those of you who don't know, is very helpful and instrumental for a lot of independent filmmakers. And so suddenly, within the year, I was having meetings with people that were really big, like HBO or A&E, BBC, like the top, documentary kind of people. And I remember taking these meetings and being very unprepared. Like I didn't have that concept yet of like, oh, you got to pitch yourself and you got to really get them excited about things. I was just like, oh, you want to talk about my, what we're working on? Sure. And it was another moment that was kind of a wake-up call, right? Like, I remember having these meetings where people were saying, well, I don't know if our audiences really want to see something like this, or I don't know if our audiences really understand something like this. And in a lot of ways, the industry, you think, takes a lot of risks, right, on new talent and new ideas and stuff, but sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes they actually are much more comfortable with something that they think follows more of a model, right? Like maybe they say, oh, well, this is a great idea, because we had an idea similar to it and it did really well. So therefore, I think this idea will probably do really well. Or I see this idea and I could see how we could talk about it this way because we had something else similar to it. Or there's another, there's another film out there that's doing that idea. Oh, it looks like it could be successful. And I think this is something that I've had to kind of wrestle with because if you're working in something new, then there might not be something similar to what you're doing out there. And you really are the person who's out there trying to make people understand why they should be paying attention to this. And I think it also made me realize that there are these gatekeepers, right? Like, as a short filmmaker, I was just making films, putting them in film festivals, but now I was trying to make a feature documentary and thinking about like, well, how do I get it distributed? How do I get it on television? How do I get it into a theater? I can't do that on my own, right? I cannot create a television network and put my film on there, right? It really is at the, there's a gatekeeper there, right, who either says, yes, I will choose it, or no, I will not. And that was kind of also kind of a wake-up call. So I remember leaving that and saying, well, we're still going to make this film. I guess we'll just have to make a really great film and show you that people really want to watch it, and hopefully that'll do it. And I remember driving to Colorado to shoot, or I was driving back from Colorado, actually, after one of our shoots. And this is now in 2005. And I got a really important phone call, which was Tia Lesson and Carl Deal, two of the producers for Michael Moore, called me and said, Hurricane Katrina had just happened. And they called me saying, we're watching the news and we're feeling like there are stories that are not being told. And we would like to go down to New Orleans and use our talents and use our skills as storytellers, as filmmakers, to try to get some of these stories that we think are not being told out of there. And I remember driving directly to New Orleans and ended up filming a documentary for them, which became Trouble the Water, which was a story that followed Kimberly Rivers and Scott Rivers, Kimberly Rivers Roberts, who basically they're a couple that lived in the lower Ninth Ward, stayed through the hurricane, didn't have the resources to leave, and ended up filming their experience through that. And for me, this was a really kind of eye-opening experience because I think what I discovered was in the process of making a documentary film, you can let the subjects tell their own story, right? This isn't about you telling their story. This is almost about you capturing their story, and they really are the voice of it. And for me, it really made me realize these are the kinds of films I want to be telling, right? I want to be telling these more character-based stories where we experience and learn something by witnessing and experiencing alongside our protagonist, right? Which is interesting because up until then, a lot of my training had been working on fiction films, right? Which is a very similar thing, right? You think of character, you think of story, you think of mood and tone and all these things. But somehow, when you start making work in documentary, there's this idea that the issue is supposed to be the most important thing. But I think what I've discovered now is the issue is important because you discover it and you experience it through someone's experience, right? And that is the most powerful thing you can do because you have some kind of empathy and you have some kind of experience. So it really changed the way that I started thinking about making nonfiction films. And I've started saying nonfiction films recently over documentary because I think it's not fair to say narrative and documentary, right? Documentaries are narratives too. Like we have a narrative story, there's a narrative structure. So I started saying nonfiction, right? Because these people are really exist in the world, right? They're not fictional, they are real people. So, so that experience really helped shape me understanding the kind of films I wanted to make and how I was going to tell them. So we finished Trinidad in 2005, I think, and it ended up, or sorry, 2008. You know, we screened it at the LA Film Festival. It was really great. It ended up on Showtime and all these things. And meanwhile, Trouble in the Water was doing really well. It won the Sundance, you know, Grand Jury Award and got nominated for an Oscar, which was amazing. And at some point, I found myself at a reception in Woodstock with the film. And I walked into this room. There was a reception that was thrown for us by Ron Newsweiner, who is a screenwriter who adapted Philadelphia Story. And he loved the film Trinidad, so he said, I'm going to throw this reception for you at upstate New York. And you know, please walk around and thank our constituents. And I did. And as I was walking around, I realized in the room, probably everyone there was over the age of maybe 70. And I don't think I had ever been in a space before where I was largely LGBT seniors. And that was something that really struck me. And I walked around and heard lots of really great stories about you know, people who had been closeted all their lives and maybe only came out after retirement or during retirement when they felt like job security was no longer an issue. You know, people who'd said that they thought they met their partner and thought that they were going to, you know, live the rest of their lives together, and then that person died during the AIDS crisis. So I started really thinking about how these seniors really were, you know, basically living history, right? They were pre-civil rights, you know, born pre-civil rights era all the way up to things like gay marriage, right? So the amount of history they've seen in their lifetime, the amount of change they've seen in their lifetime was huge, right? And around the same time, I was having conversations with my mother who was thinking of retiring and kind of like what that looks like. And it started making me think about just kind of my own life as someone who's on one side of the spectrum moving over to the other side, right? So it felt like a very personal film to make. And I think what I realized at that moment was, you know, with Trinidad, part of the reason why I wanted to make Trinidad was not only to explore the idea of trans identity, because as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I don't feel like I've ever been not in, you know, I've never felt like my physical expression didn't match my internal identity, let's put it that way, right? So I wanted to learn more. But I also think I wanted to make it because I think it really challenged my ideas of a small town, right? Small town stereotypes. So with this next film, I think what I realized was I'm making films because they're personal to me, right? Like there's something there that I'm connecting with on a personal level and want to explore. So I decided to make this next film, which is called Before You Know It. And of course, you know, I did all the labs and I brought it around to the industry, and some of the reaction was, you know, oh, you shouldn't make films about old people, and you shouldn't make films about, you know, gay old people. I was like, okay. And I remember even screening some, you know, a sample clip where part of it was shot in a bar, and some, you know, some executive was like, oh, you know, you should really make a film about young young gay people in a gay bar. And I was like, okay, this is totally missing the point of what I'm making. And again, these ideas of like, no one's, who's going to want to watch this? Who's your audience for this? But what I started realizing at that point was that the more that you make something true to the subject and the more that you honor like the authenticity of that experience, in a way, the more universal it actually becomes, right? And it does a disservice if you try to water it down and you try to, not be true to the actual story. And so with that one, I decided, I'm going to stay. I'm gonna be truthful to this. I'm gonna do this. Yes, people are telling me not to, but this is where I have to really give a shout out to PBS, right? Because ITVS, which is the independent television service, they, which is a funding entity that makes, that funds producers to make work for PBS, they saw this as something that was really important. And thanks to them, I was able to make this film. And what's really great about that also is every time I'm trying to make a film, I'm also looking for a new experience. So this was really great. Whereas one end, I was making Trinidad with like not a whole lot of support, just beg, steal, or borrow. And this time, I actually had public broadcast who was helping me make this film. And that was a really great experience. So after I made that film, I got invited to screen both of these films in the Philippines, which for me was exciting, kind of bringing it full circle, right? As you know, I was born and raised in the United States. I really didn't have much connection to the Philippines. But in 2014, Nick De Ocampo, who is a filmmaker and film scholar, invited me to come to the Philippines to screen my documentaries for an LGBT film festival there. And I thought to myself, like, this is going to be an amazing experience for me because I've never really gone to the Philippines as an adult. I've been wanting to go and kind of experience it on my own and kind of get familiar with the LGBT community there as well. And so when I went there, what I discovered was actually an LGBT community that was outraged over the death of Jennifer Laude, right? And Jennifer Laude was a trans woman that unfortunately was killed by a US Marine. And it was definitely in the news and definitely in my social media feeds, but it didn't go really beyond just the initial story of a trans woman being murdered. But long story short, while I was there, I ended up on a panel for LGBT rights, and I happened to be sitting alongside attorney Virginia Suarez, and she was someone who was representing the Laude family for this crime. And she showed a clip of Jennifer's mother, and Jennifer's mother was basically saying, how could someone do this to my child? I'm not going to stop until I see some kind of accountability. And that just really kind of lit a fire in me to, really think about how this story not only was telling the story of, of a lot of people in the LGBT community, specifically trans women who experience some kind of violence, but also this idea of the Philippines up against a foreign superpower, right, like the US, and me recognizing that I was somewhere in between, right? Like, as someone who was born and raised in the United States, I certainly had some kind of understanding of the Philippines because my family came from there, but also I also knew from going through the public school system that people did not know anything about the Philippines, right? And at the same time, while I'm standing in the Philippines, I'm recognizing a lot of the privilege that I have while I'm there as an American citizen. So funny enough, on that panel, someone suggests that I turn this into my new film, and I say, someone should absolutely make this into a film. I don't know if it should be me. I don't know if I'm the right person. I'm not from the Philippines. Maybe it should be someone who's an activist who's already here on the ground. But I have to give a lot of credit to, to my partner, who's actually sitting right there, Curran Nault, who was with me at the time, and he basically said, well, maybe you should consider making this because this is something that's important to you and this is something that you can explore, and you're basically always making these films that are actually very personal, whether or not it appears that way. They're very personal to you because it's something you don't, something you really want to explore. And I think I realized at that moment, like, this is why I make films. Like, there is something that I'm interested in exploring, and it's kind of that journey of making the film for me to understand something. And my research is actually filming people and talking to people, and it helps me formulate my ideas about it and really figuring out my own personal connection to it. And I remember coming back to the United States thinking about that and speaking to some friends, and one friend told me, you really should make this film not only because you should make it, but you need to make it because no one else might be able to make it, right? You have the resources here in the United States, you should do it. And so I, decided I'm gonna take that risk, right? And I'm gonna make this film in another country. And I knew, and of course the industry reaction was like, don't make a film overseas. Don't make a film about Asians, right? Films about Asia don't do well in the marketplace. Don't make a film about trans people, right? People only want to see films that are funny, about funny trans people now, things like that. Nobody wants to think about, trans people being murdered, right? Some of the other reactions I got were, is this film about U.S. imperialism or is it about trans identity? It can't be about both, right? You have to choose. And it just really drove me crazy that there was, that you were not encouraged to have this more, thinking about this story from the kind of complicated position that it deserved to be discussed. Let's put it that way. So I decided if I'm going to go through this experience again, and let me preface this, every time I've finished a film, I've always said to myself, that's the last time I'm making a film. Or not making a film, but I'd say, oh, that's the last time I'm making a film like this, or that's the last time I'm going to do that because it's so hard. But with this one, I just thought, like, well, here's my opportunity to try to do something different, right? And I thought also to myself, like, I had been experiencing the Philippines, and it was such a beautiful country and such a beautiful culture. I said, I really want to treat it the way it deserves to be treated. And I remember having these meetings where people were saying, like, oh, well, it's probably going to be this very, like, gritty handheld. And I was like, no, it's actually going to be really beautiful, and it's actually going to be really high production value because a story like this deserves that. And I feel like I took a risk there. And this is something I do want to impress on people, is that no one asks you to take the next artistic step forward. You kind of have to do it yourself, right? You have to challenge yourself, and you have to say, like, I want to think bigger, and I want to make something bigger and challenge myself that way. Because a lot of people will not encourage you to do that, right? They want you to do something similar to what you've already done and maybe do it a little bit cheaper and a little bit faster, right? So in this case, I kind of went the opposite way. I said, I'm going to make a film that's going to be a lot more challenging in a lot of these different ways, and I'm going to also treat it with the care and respect that it deserves, and I'm also going to think about the way that I'm making it, right? So one of the great things that happened was I was able to bring on a full producing team of all Filipino, Filipino-American, Filipino-Canadian producers, and they were all making this film, for their own personal reasons. And that was something that was really important to me, because around this time period, I was also noticing that there was a lot of talk in the industry, finally, right, about diversity and inclusion and equity. And part of me started thinking about, we always talk about how we want to change things. Well, we should just do it by the way we make our films, right? So I was really fortunate to get this producing team to work with me, and we ended up making this film. Premiered it at Tribeca last year. It's been playing, around the world. I'm actually going to the Philippines later this week because it'll be opening in theaters there. It's been a really amazing experience. And the last thing I'll say is that, when I made this film, I didn't, up until that point, as I mentioned, I thought I had been making films just for myself, right? These are films that I want to see. And I remember at that moment thinking, I should make this film because I'm the person who actually needs to see this film, right? As someone who grew up in the United States knowing very little about the Philippines, as someone who understands a lot of the violence towards the LGBT community, like, this is a film that I should make because it's a film that I want to see myself, right? But the process of making this film and putting it out into the world, I'm starting to realize that films themselves are their own entities, right? And they can have an impact greater than you ever thought that it could. And certainly that's been my experience seeing this film out in the world. When we premiered it, we had a lot of people who came up to us and said, wow, I've never seen people out on the streets marching over the death of a trans person. That's amazing that that happens in the Philippines. I had a lot of young Asian women come up and say, it's amazing that the subjects of your film are all strong, women. Like, that is something that's inspiring. And I've seen people now screen this film and be able to discuss it on their own. And it makes me really think about, what I kind of want to end with is, why do you make films, right? Like, just the simple question of, why do you make films, right? And I think early on I thought I made films just for myself, and I still do, but I have to recognize films have an impact, right? And films can create discussions, and kind of coming full circle, films can also save people, right? Like, when I think about it, going back to growing up in this small town, films were my outlet, right? So I would love to think that now whatever I'm creating is not just for me, right? But it's for other people too. So thank you for listening to me, and I'd love to take any questions if you have them. Sure.
Looking back, is there anything that you wish that you would have done differently in your career, or do you think that every point kind of led you to where you are?
So a question about looking back, is there anything I would have done different in my career?
Yeah.
In general?
In general.
In general, is there anything anything I would have done different in my career in general? That's a good question. I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Because I think I'm a very reactionary person, so I think something, as you can tell, right? Someone says something to me and it makes me go in one direction. So, in that sense, no. I mean, I think if anything, I just, I think if anything, I would have just not had that period where I wasn't making my own work, right? That I would have. And it wasn't really that long. I mean, I pretty much started making Trinidad, shortly after. But I think there was a moment there where the agent is telling you, oh yeah, so what I forgot to mention is when I signed up with this agency, the first thing they said was, don't ever tell people you're a director. They said, don't say you're a director, don't say you've ever made your own work, don't say you've gone to these film festivals on your own as a director. Nobody wants to hire someone like that. We want, the industry really likes you to be one thing. And I still hear it. I actually just heard it the other day. I'm not gonna say who said it, but someone said it they said, oh, don't wear many hats, wear one hat. That's what they want you to do. And I just, I think if anything, if I just wish there would have been someone there to say, no, wear all the hats, do it yourself, But I think I kind of had to discover that on my own, and I wish I would have discovered that a little bit sooner and got comfortable with that. And I guess I wish I would have realized there are people in the industry who do support that idea and appreciate that idea, Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You talk about yourself usually as a cinematographer. Can you talk about the editing process at all? How do you work, with an editor by yourself?
Yeah, I love working with editors. I actually really hate editing. Hate is a strong word. I don't hate editing. I think it's really important, but I don't do very well sitting in a room with footage. I like watching things. And funny enough, sitting right behind you is Victoria Chalk, who is an editor that I've worked with a lot, who's amazing. And in fact, Victoria is this year's Karen Schmier Fellow, which is amazing. And I love the edit process because I look at it as a collaboration, right? Like, I let the editor take the footage, turn it into something different, and then what I like to do is watch it and give notes and be able to shape it with them. But I recognize if I get into the edit room too early, I'll do a disservice to what is actually captured on the footage itself, if that makes any sense. The other thing I will say is, as I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of like labs and stuff. I've done a lot of like edit labs and works in progress labs, and I always get something out of that because it kind of gets you out of your brain and lets you experience someone else's experience of watching your cut. Yeah.
Hey, I really enjoyed hearing your history and what drives you and the why behind what you make. And I'm curious if you ever find yourself in a project that's fun, but not driven by, like, oh, this is my mission, this is what I'm out to communicate, and then you have to recalibrate around, what is the purpose behind it?
Yeah. Actually, one thing I didn't go into because I was like, oh, I'm running out of time, is while I was, which is funny because when I first said this, I was like, how am I going to fill up this time period just talking about my career? While I have been making feature documentaries, I also started collaborating very heavily with a performance artist named Paul Swallow. And he has a persona called Christeene, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with and have seen any of Christeene's work. Very unapologetic, kind of a cross between Iggy Pop, Pee Wee Herman, and Divine is the way that I would describe it. And it's been really great. I've done a series of music videos with this performer, and it's really like super punk, like whatever we want to do. It's unapologetic. There's no permission needed, and it's helped me really balance that idea of making longer length work that is much more focused on maybe a social issue and a social message versus just pure expression and being reactionary to the times. So for me, that's been it's a nice balance, right? And one thing I want to say is, I didn't mention this earlier, but I do think there is a weird balance that I've kind of recognized is even with every person that's been very negative and saying, don't make this, nobody wants to see this. There's always been someone else there to say, do make this, because it sounds cool, it sounds great, like I would love to help you. And I think this is also part of my balance, is I like making work that is much more meditative and takes longer, and then at the same time, I find a lot of value in making shorter work that's unexpected and really, beg, steal, or borrow kind, right? It just kind of makes you make and do. So I think that might be all the time we have. So thank you so much for coming, and I'll stick around if anyone has any questions. Thanks.